The bread has been in the oven since before the sun touched the eastern edge of the Aventine hill, and the smell of it, that particular warmth, that golden, yeasty comfort that belongs to no single century but to every morning that has ever existed, drifts out through the low doorway and into the street where the city of Rome is already, loudly, magnificently alive. It is the kind of morning that asks nothing of you, the kind that simply offers itself, unhurried and generous, like a letter written by someone who loved you and had all the time in the world. Carts are grinding over stone. A woman is arguing beautifully with a fish seller 3 stalls down. 2 boys are running somewhere important for reasons that will not matter by afternoon. The Tiber is doing what the Tiber always does, moving slowly, smelling faintly of itself, indifferent to emperors and bakers and small fires alike. Rome in the early morning is not the marble city of the history books. It is narrower than that, louder, closer. It smells of bread and animals and the particular intimacy of 500,000 people living nearly on top of one another, separated by walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's dreams. Go ahead and settle in. Pull whatever is closest and warm just a little nearer, because this part of the story, the before part, is the most important part, and it deserves your full, unhurried attention. The bakery belongs to a man named Marcus Sulla, not the famous one, not anyone history will bother to remember. Just a man in his late 40s with flour on his forearms and a small debt that has been keeping him awake for 6 nights running. His oven is built into the back wall of his shop, the way all the ovens on this street are built, low, clay-lined, mud sen, fed by wood that is delivered every 3 days from a merchant named Draco, who always charges slightly more than he should and smiles while doing it. The wood today is dry. It has been a dry summer, the kind of summer that turns everything it touches into something that might, under the wrong conditions, become fuel. Marcus does not think about this. Why would he? He has made bread in this oven for 19 years. He knows its moods, its temperatures, its particular way of breathing heat back into the room. He knows the way the flame settles after the first hour, how the embers arrange themselves into something steady and reliable and manageable. He is not a careless man. He is simply a man who is thinking about a debt and a debtor and an address across the city that he needs to reach before the 3rd hour of the day. He banks the coals carefully, or what feels like carefully. Then he unties his apron, steps into the morning, and does not look back. To understand what is about to happen, you need to stand back from the bakery for a moment and look at the city the way a bird would look at it, or the way a fire would. From above, Rome in the 1st century does not look the way the paintings suggest. There is no clean geometry, no orderly grid of wide avenues leading serenely to temple steps. What you see instead, if you hover over the Aventine on a warm morning with a dry wind coming in from the south, is a tangle. A beautiful, breathing, catastrophically flammable tangle. The insulae rise on every side. Apartment buildings stacked 4, 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high, their upper floors jutting out over the alleys below, so that in some places the sky above the street narrows to a single strip of pale blue, barely wide enough for light to fall. Through, these buildings are made primarily of wood. The frames are wood, the interior walls are wood, the furniture inside is wood, the shutters hanging at every window are wood, and they are dry, and many of them have not been properly maintained since the previous tenant, whoever they were, decided to leave or was made to leave or simply disappeared the way people sometimes do in large cities. There are stone buildings too, the grand ones, the public ones, the kind that get written about, but the people who are not grand and not public live in the Insulae, and the Insulae are waiting, always waiting, in the patient and mindless way that kindling waits. Rome knew this. The city had always known this. There had been laws, there were always laws, about how high buildings could go. about setbacks from the street, about the materials permitted in construction within certain zones. The laws existed because the fires had already happened. Rome had burned before, in patches and in sections, in fast, terrible nights that left whole neighborhoods as ash and memory. The laws were written by men who had seen the smoke, who had stood in the ruins, who had promised themselves and each other that this time it would be different. But laws and landlords have always had a complicated relationship, and in Rome, as in every city that would come after it, the cheapest way to house the most people was also inevitably the most dangerous. The insulae kept rising. The wood kept being used. The upper floors kept leaning over the alleys, sharing walls with their neighbors, sharing the particular fragility of everything built too quickly for people with too little money and no one powerful enough to argue on their behalf. The city was not waiting to burn. It simply had never stopped, and on the third alley off the main road, on the southwestern slope of the Aventine, in the back of a bakery, a careful man has just banked his coals and walked away. Something small and patient and orange is beginning, very slowly, to reconsider the arrangement. Marcus walks quickly, the way a man walks when he has somewhere to be and something to resolve, and the city opens around him the way the city always does, in bursts of noise and colour and the particular democratic chaos that belongs to Rome's streets in the morning hours. He passes a man selling onions from a basket hung at his hip. He steps around a dog sleeping in the exact centre of the road, with the magnificent confidence of an animal that has never once been hurried by anyone. He nods to a woman he knows only by the colour of her door, red, very red, redder than any other door on the block, and she nods back, and that is the entire relationship, complete and sufficient. He is thinking about Quintus. Quintus owes him money. Not a catastrophic amount, not the kind of debt that ruins a man, but enough to matter, enough to have sat at the back of Marcus's mind for the past 6 mornings like a pebble in a sandal. Quintus lives on the other side of the hill, near the river, in a better neighbourhood than Marcus, which is itself a small daily injustice that Marcus has never spoken aloud but feels continuously. He rehearses the conversation as he walks. He imagines himself calm, firm, unhurried. He imagines Quintus paying without argument. He has been imagining this for 6 days. He does not think about the oven. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The simplicity of it. He is not a negligent man. He is not someone who cuts corners or dismisses risk with a wave. He is a man who has banked those coals 10,000 times and walked away 10,000 times and returned each time to find everything exactly as he left it, the bread finished, the oven breathing down to its embers, the walls cool to the touch. Expert. Iance is a form of faith, and Marcus believes in his oven the way he believes in the street under his feet, not because he has tested it, but because it has never yet failed him. What he does not know, what he cannot know, and this is the part that will stay with you, is that this morning the coals settled differently. A single piece of wood, drier than the rest and positioned just slightly wrong, shifted after he left. A small column of heat found a gap in the clay lining that has been widening slowly for about 3 years. The air inside the back wall of the bakery is doing what warm air does when it finds somewhere new to go. It is, at this point, still a very small thing, the size of a coin, the size of a coin, the size of a question, the size of any ordinary mistake made by any ordinary person on any ordinary morning in a city of 500,000 souls, none of whom right now have any reason to look up from their own particular life and wonder if something somewhere nearby is quietly beginning to change. Marcus turns the corner toward Quintus's street. Behind him the morning continues, golden and oblivious and warm. It is not the fire that speaks first. It is never the fire. It is the smell. On the 2nd floor of the Insula directly attached to Marcus's bakery, a woman named Flavia is doing what she does every morning at this hour, sitting near the window with a bowl of yesterday's bread softened in water, watching the street below with the particular unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere specific to be and has made a kind of art of observation. She is somewhere between 50 and 60 years old and has lived in this building for longer than most of its current residents have been alive. She knows its sounds. She knows the way it settles in the afternoon heat. She knows the groan of the staircase and the creak of the floor near the far wall and the particular silence tie. That means the family above her has finally gone out. She notices the smell at approximately the second hour of the day. It is not alarming. Not yet. It is only a sharpness in the air, a warmth that is slightly wrong, a hint of something more intense than the ordinary bakery smell she wakes to every morning. She looks down at the street. The street is normal. She looks at her hands. Normal. She tilts her head the way people do when they are asking their own senses a question, and her senses answer quietly that something is perhaps not quite right, and she thinks someone has let their bread go too long, and she takes another piece of softened bread from her bowl and does not move from her chair. 3 floors above her, a young man named Tertius, who works in the evenings and sleeps in the mornings, surfaces briefly from sleep, registers the smell, thinks fire, and then thinks no, bakery, and falls back into the warm dark of the unconcerned. In the alley beside the building, a spice merchant named Ilya stops for just a moment, looks up, sees nothing, looks back down, and continues unpacking her crates. Later, she will remember this moment with a specificity that surprises her. The weight of the crate, the color of the street. But right now, it is just a pause in a busy morning, the kind the mind barely notes and mostly forgets. This is the window, this slow, quiet, completely human interval between something being wrong and someone deciding to say so. It lasts perhaps 15 minutes. Perhaps 20, long enough that later, when people try to reconstruct the morning, no one can agree on exactly when it became undeniable, because it happened in the way most disasters happen, not all at once, but in small, individually deniable increments, each one almost reasonable, each one making the next one slightly more catastrophic. The fire has now moved through the back wall of the bakery and found the wooden frame of the staircase in the building next door. It is still, by the standards of what it will become, a very small fire, but it has found something to hold on to, and it is no longer small in the way it matters. There is a particular cruelty in the way Rome was designed, and cruelty might be too strong a word, or it might be exactly right, depending on how you feel about the relationship between profit and consequence. The Insulae were not built to last. This was not a secret. The men who commissioned them, the landlords who owned entire blocks of them, the property developers who grew very comfortable on the income they generated, none of them were under any illusions about the permanence of the structures in which the city's poorest and most numerous residents slept every night. They were built to exist, to be occupied, to generate rent. Their relationship to time was purely financial, and financially speaking, they were extremely successful. One of the problems was the shared walls. In a city as densely built as Rome, buildings did not merely stand beside each other. They leaned, they merged. They shared not just walls but structural elements, staircases, drainage channels, the very foundations in some cases pressing against each other like passengers on a full cart who have simply stopped noticing the closeness. This was efficient. It was economical. In a fire, it was a highway. The engineers who designed the original street plans, some of them had understood this. There are records, careful and dry in the way, records always are, of proposals for wider streets, for mandatory gaps between structures, for fire breaks built into the urban grid. These proposals existed. Some were even adopted for a while in some places under certain administrations, and then rents climbed and land became more valuable, and the gaps were quietly filled, and the records about the proposals outlasted the proposals themselves. So when the fire in the back of Marcus's bakery found the shared wall between his building and the one beside it, a wall that in theory was stone but in practice had been patched with wood twice in the last decade, because stone was expensive, and the landlord, a man named Gaius Porcius, who lived 3 miles away in a house with a garden, had approved the cheaper repair. It did not stop at the wall. It continued, as it had every structural invitation to do, into the next building and then into the space between that building and the one beyond, where years of accumulated debris, rags, broken furniture, old rope, the particular dry detritus of urban poverty, waited with perfect patience. The city's designers had made it beautiful. The city's economics had made it dangerous. These two facts had coexisted for generations, and people had lived inside that coexistence and called it home and meant it sincerely, because what else do you call the place where you sleep and eat and argue and love and raise whatever small life you have managed to make? This is the part where the story becomes something other than one man's mistake. It was always going to be someone's mistake. The city was built to receive it. Rome had a fire brigade. This is important to know, and it is important to hold it in your mind as the morning continues. Because the existence of the vigils, 7,000 men organized into 7 cohorts, each one responsible for 2 of the city's 14 administrative regions, represents something both admirable and, today, slightly heartbreaking. The admirable part is that the vigiles existed at all, that some emperor at some point in Rome's long and complicated history looked at his burning city and said, "We need to organize a response to this." The heartbreaking part requires line knowing where cohort 4 is at approximately the 2nd hour of this particular morning. They are on the Caelian Hill. This is not their fault. Fires do not schedule themselves according to available resources, and cohort 4, under the command of a man named Decimus, who has 17 years of experience and a thoroughness that his colleagues respect, even when it frustrates them, is responding to a report of a structural fire in a warehouse near the cattle market. The warehouse, as it happens, turned out to be mostly smoke and very little actual flame, a smouldering bale of hay that 2 of his men handled within the first 10 minutes. But by the time they established this, and by the time the cart carrying the water siphons was turned around, and by the time the messenger who had been dispatched toward the event team with updated orders navigated through the morning market crowd near the forum, time had passed. This is the ordinary tragedy within the larger one, not malice, not incompetence, not the failure of any individual person to do what they were supposed to do. Decimus is good at his job. His men are trained. The system that Rome built for exactly this kind of mourning was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely sophisticated. The vigiles patrolled at night. They carried equipment. They had protocols. They were in every measurable way prepared. But the city was large, and the cohorts were finite, and on this particular morning, the wrong fire got the first attention, and the right fire got the second, and in the interval between those two things, the staircase in the Insulae beside Marcus's bakery collapsed inward. Nobody was on it. This is a mercy, and the story will take its mercies where it finds them. Flavia on the 2nd floor heard it go, a sound like furniture falling, she will say later, like someone dropping everything they owned, all at once. And this time she stood up from her chair. This time she looked not at the street, but at her door. This time something in her chest, some old animal knowledge that lives below the level of thought, told her that the thing she smelled earlier and chose not to name had named itself. She moved toward the door. Below her, the fire was moving too. There is a moment, and it lasts only a moment, which is almost the worst part. where the fire is still something you could describe as manageable. This moment passes before anyone can act on it, but it exists, and in retrospect it will be the moment everyone wishes they could return to. It is the last moment where the story could have been different. Then the moment ends. What happens to a street when a fire of this size and this hunger finally reaches the open air is difficult to describe without resorting to language that feels too large, too dramatic, too much like the fire is being made into something glorious when really it is only destructive and indifferent, and entirely without intention. But there is a quality to it in the accounts that survive, scratched onto tablets, pressed into letters, described in the flat administrative language of damage reports, but even the plainest language cannot quite contain. The light, everyone seems to agree, was extraordinary, not beautiful exactly, or beautiful in the way that dangerous things can be beautiful when they are happening to someone else, or when you are watching from a distance that does not yet feel insufficient. The upper floors of the insula went first, because heat rises and wood is wood, and within the time it might take to eat a leisurely breakfast, the top of the building was producing a column of smoke visible from the far side of the Tiber. This is when the street changed. This is when the noise changed. Up until now, the sounds of the fire had been interior sounds. The wind, creaking, the hissing, the deep structural groan of a building adjusting to a new reality. But now the sounds came outside, and the street received them, and the street became a different kind of place. People poured from doorways. This is both the instinct and the danger. The doorways of buildings that shared a wall with the fire were no longer the exits they appeared to be, and the street, which seemed like safety, was narrow enough that the heat coming off the building hit the opposite wall and found the wooden shutters there and found them receptive. A woman named Lucia, who lived 3 buildings down and had been hanging laundry when the smoke column appeared, will later describe watching the shutters across the alley from her couch as though someone had drawn a line of flame along them with a careful finger, one after another, neat almost, as though the fire knew exactly where it was going. The alley between the burning block and the street behind it was, at its narrowest point, approximately the width of 2 men standing with their arms spread. The fire crossed it in less than a minute. This is the architecture of catastrophe in its simplest and most terrible form. Not an explosion, not a sudden violence, but a steady and methodical claiming of space. The fire did not rage. It expanded. It found every gap that the city's builders had left it, and walked through those gaps with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. In the street, people ran and carried what they could, and called names into smoke. On the 4th floor of a building that has perhaps 40 minutes left, a woman named Livia stands in the center of her single room and tries to think clearly. She is 31 years old. She has lived in this room for 4 years, first with her husband, who died of a fever in the 3rd year, and now alone, which is its own kind of life, smaller and quieter, but not without its dignities. The room contains a sleeping mat, a wooden chest, 2 clay lamps, a small bronze figure of a household deity that belonged to her mother, an extra tunic, a basket with 3 days of food, a clay cup she has had since she was a girl, and a box, no bigger than 2 hands placed side by side, which holds letters she will never read again but cannot discard because they are the last written evidence that a specific voice once existed in the world. She can carry perhaps 2 things, maybe 3 if she uses both arms and the fabric of her tunic as a bundle: the clay cup, the bronze figure, the box. She takes them. She does not deliberate for very long, which will surprise her later. She will have expected herself to be slower, more uncertain, more tragic about it. But the body knows, when the choice is forced, what the heart values, and her hands moved before she had quite finished deciding. The chest she leaves, the food she leaves, the sleeping mat she leaves. She goes down the stairs, and the stairs are hot under her feet, even through her sandals, and the smoke at the bottom of the stairwell is already the kind of smoke that makes your eyes close against it. She comes out into the street, and the light is wrong, too orange, too shifting, the shadows moving in the wrong direction, and she holds the box and the cup and the bronze figure against her chest, and she moves, because standing still is no longer an option. This is what the great fires of history are made of, not the columns of smoke visible from the Tiber, not the administrative reports about which blocks were lost and what the damage estimates came to and how many days before the rebuilding could begin. They are made of this, a woman on a fourth floor with 40 minutes and 2 hands and a box of letters from someone who is gone. They are made of what Flavia took from her room and what Elia the spice merchant had time to move from her stall, and what Tertius grabbed when he finally woke properly to the sound of his building speaking its last. Every person who ran from that fire ran with something in their hands, and every one of those things meant something specific to a specific life, and the fire took everything else, which was most of it. Livia walks away from the street without looking back. She has learned already, in her 31 years, that looking back is its own kind of burning. By the time the vigils reached the Aventine in sufficient numbers, 3 cohorts working together, something that only happened when the scale of the situation made coordination unavoidable. The fire had consumed 7 full blocks, damaged 14 more, and rendered approximately 2,000 people without a roof by nightfall. These are the numbers from the surviving records, which means they are probably conservative, because the people easiest to leave out of records are always the ones who had the least to begin with. The fire did not stop because it was extinguished. It stopped largely because it ran out of building. This is the other thing about the design of the city, the thing that works in reverse, the accidental mercy built into the same overcrowding that made it dangerous. At a certain point where the blocks thinned and the alley widened and a storage yard of stone and clay created an uninflammable gap, the fire simply had nowhere new to go. It subsided over the course of the afternoon, going from the terrible thing it had been to a smaller thing, and then to a smouldering thing, and then to a smouldering thing, and then to smoke and hiss, and the particular grey quiet of aftermath. Marcus came back to the Aventine in the late afternoon. He had gotten the money from Quintus, who paid without argument, which Marcus had not expected, and was in better spirits than he had been in a week when he turned down his street and found it not there, not gone, exactly. The street was still a street. The stones were still stones, but the buildings he knew, the Insula where Flavia sat every morning, the spice stall where Elia unpacked her crates, the narrow gap between 2 walls where he had sheltered from rain 100 times, had been replaced by something structural and silent that still breathed a thin smoke into the evening air. He stood there for a long time. Rome as a city, as an institution, as a civilization that had seen all of this before and would see it again, began the process of forgetting with considerable efficiency. Within 2 days, surveyors were measuring the empty ground. Within a week, the lumber merchants had been contacted. Within a month, new foundations were being laid, which would, inevitably, be cheaper than they should be, and taller than was strictly wise, and pressed against their neighbours in the way the old buildings had been, because the need for housing had not changed, and the economics had not changed, and grief, however sincere, has never once changed the price of land. There were no formal inquiries. No one looked for Marcus. His small and human mistake was already invisible inside the much larger mistake of the city's design, which was also invisible inside the much larger fact that 500,000 people needed somewhere to sleep, and the only viable answer was also the dangerous one. Rome rebuilt. It always rebuilt. That was, depending on the day, either its greatest strength or the saddest thing about it. Here is what you should carry with you As the story settles and the smoke clears and the ordinary sounds of the world begin to find their way back in. Marcus lived, Flavia lived. Livia walked out of that street with her bronze figure and her box of letters, and it seems kept living the kind of life that does not make it into the records but leaves its traces anyway, in the things people carry, in the choices made under 40 minutes of pressure, in the small and absolute certainty of what a person reaches for when everything else is being taken away. The bakery was rebuilt within the year by a different man, using mostly the same materials. The insula beside it, the one with the shared wall, the one where the staircase had been patched with cheaper wood, went up faster still. It was, by all architectural accounts, very similar to its predecessor. A little taller perhaps, because the demand for rooms had increased and the available land had not. The upper floors leaned over the alley at approximately the same angle. What you have just listened to is not a story about one man's mistake. It never was. It is a story about what happens when a city grows faster than its own wisdom, when the people who make the rules live far enough from the consequences that the consequences feel abstract, when the distance between a landlord and a tenant is precisely the distance between comfort and risk. It is a story Rome told itself over and over, in smoke and in ash, and kept not quite hearing. You have heard it tonight. That is something. And if you find yourself thinking, in the slow, warm edge of sleep, that this story sounds familiar, that you have seen its shape before in other centuries, in other cities, in other buildings where the walls were thinner than they should have been and the exits fewer than they needed to be, you are not wrong. And you are not imagining it. Every city that has ever burned began with something ordinary: a dry summer, a distracted man, a wall that was patched when it should have been replaced, a law that existed on paper and dissolved in practice, an ember left just slightly wrong in a clay oven on a street that no longer exists, in a city that has not existed for 1,000 years, in a morning so ordinary it could have been any morning in any century. The ember is still falling. It always is. But you are warm, and the story is finished, and tonight at least, only tonight, everything is quiet.